day 2, and I'm glad that you've all made it. So this is part 2 of the SharePoint Designer What's New. Who came to the part 1? Oh, good, okay. I did leave some of the slides in just to quickly go over the introduction bit, but we are going to spend the rest of the hour on workflows. Okay. Just like in SharePoint 2007, workflows is a big area. I sometimes teach SharePoint Designer. Some of you, I believe, have been on my course. And even though I spend perhaps half a day on it, which is sort of like some lecture time and then some hands-on, you still don't get through very much. And I often say, right, on a particular website that I maintain, I always put some how-to links so that you can then practice or investigate some aspects that I'm not going to cover. Well, it's even more true with this version. We thought if you thought you had a lot of actions last time and the breadth of using them, you had to see somebody else's example to understand how to use them, then there are a lot more this time, and we'll go through some of them. So I can only scratch the scene as to what's added with the workflows. So a little bit about myself. I'm Penny Coventry. I'm an SharePoint server MVP, independent consultant. I write some books. A lot of you have heard that all before, so that was a brief version. I'm going to go through a little bit here. I forgot to amend that agenda. That was the agenda for the whole bit when it was in one bit. But mostly it's just workflow, all right? This is just an introduction for those people who weren't here last time. SharePoint Designer, it's the preferred tool for building solutions. And if you look at the 6-pillar diagram that Microsoft have released about SharePoint 2010, then SharePoint Designer is in the composite sector. Okay, so we're trying to build solutions. SharePoint Designer, I know it's got designer in the name, but it's a lot more than just branding your sites. Okay, branding with SharePoint Designer is it's a minor activity for the tool itself. Here's the list of improvements, and what we kind of concentrate is on the workflows. Now in SharePoint 2007, the workflows were based on .NET 3. The workflows that SharePoint 2010 uses is based on .NET 3.5. Before I go into workflows, just remember the little caveat I talked about yesterday. If you do need to amend your SharePoint 2007 sites, your Windows SharePoint Services 3.0 sites, then you need to install SharePoint Designer 2007. SharePoint Designer 2010 does not open SharePoint 2007 and Windows SharePoint Services 3.0 sites. Okay, so if you need to maintain both sites, then you need to install them side by side. Now, SharePoint Designer 2010 does come in 64-bit as well as 32-bit. I see no reason really why to use 64-bit, but definitely if you are going to install both SharePoint Designer 2007 and 2010 side by side, you must install the 32-bit. You can't mix and match any of the Office client 32 bits and a 64-bit. They must all on your computer be either all 64 or all 32. And since SharePoint Designer 2007 only came as a 32-bit, if you're in that scenario where you need to maintain both environments, you need to really go with all the 32-bit client programs. Right. Okay. So, what is a workflow as far as SharePoint's concerned? Well, it's something we're going to do with list items, files within documents, And now, new for SharePoint 2010, we can actually create a workflow at the site level. So if there's something you need to do there. There are two different types of workflows in SharePoint, and this is the same with the previous version of SharePoint. There's declarative workflows. They are workflows that are like XML text within a file, which you could read if you really want to. And that text, though, in those files, it adheres to something called the Extendable Object Markup Language. And what happens is, yes, we could read them themselves because it's just a form of XML. And when they actually get executed, then SharePoint itself passes that XML data and works out what to do when you initiate a workflow based on one of those declarative workflow types. And that's why in SharePoint Designer 2007, you will see a number of files created for you. And that's what the declarative means. Now, compiled is something that Visual Studio will create. Yes, your developer could write declarative workflows, but normally they will write code which needs to be compiled into a DLL, and that DLL needs to go on each server. Whereas the declarative workflows that are created by SharePoint Designer, when you click publish, will actually end up into a content database. Okay. Who has done workflows in SharePoint Designer 2007? Okay, right, okay. So one of the first things you need to do when you're thinking about your workflow and how to meet your business needs, because we're not just doing it because we like playing around with technology, is SharePoint provides us with a number of means to help with our business work processes. So, for example, there's the Alert Me functionality, where a person decides that there's something happening, perhaps it's a particular set of search keywords, that when SharePoint finds information that meets those keywords again, it would like to get emails about those new contents or if content has changed. Now, the Alert Me is a push type of mechanism, all right? However you configure it, whether it's a daily one or a weekly one, you're going to push information to yourself that meets your criteria. So you could say, right, as part of my business process, that's sufficient for me. Then there's the RSS mechanism of being informed of information. That is a pull type of process. This says, right, it's not very important to me that certain things are happening. I just want to be kept informed, and it's up to me to decide by using an RSS reader when I go and find about information and which RSS feeds I subscribe to. Then there's a sort of a lightweight workflow provided within SharePoint. It's been there for a number of years now, which is content approval. All that does is add another column to your list or library, and you can decide to change the state of a document or a list item from pending to approval. No email gets sent, but it is a sort of a lightweight workflow. And then there are the proper workflows that you can create. Well, there's ones that come out of the box, and I've got a session tomorrow talking about the out-of-the-box ones. And then there's the ones you can create with SharePoint Designer.
The ones out of the box in SharePoint different from 2010 to 2010?
Most of them are the same, but what's the capability in SharePoint Server is that if you've got the Visio Services working, the services application working, the out-of-the-box ones provide you with a Visio-like diagram of how you're progressing through the process. So instead of just having a column that says in progress and then go into that in progress page and seeing what's the status, it will come up as a Visio diagram, and if it's an approval process, it will have some ticks beside it. There's not any new out-of-the-box ones. Okay. I believe. I'll just recheck that tomorrow for tomorrow's one, but my memory's going. And then there's SharePoint Designer workflows, and then there's the ones you can create with the Visual Studio. Then there's another thing you can create called an event receiver. Now, an event receiver has to be created by your developers, and your event receivers are not really to do with the business process that deals with human interaction. Okay? So if something always needs to happen, right, then perhaps the best way to do is get your developer to write an event receiver, because they are much more efficient at doing that. So you are, as I say, by coming to this session, you are going to be the solution developers. Okay? So it's up to you to choose the best tool that meets your needs. Now, SharePoint Designer, yes, could be that tool to create the workflow for your particular business. It's also a good rapid application tool. And we'll also see with this version, if you create a workflow with SharePoint Designer 2010, you can export it out, and then it can be imported into Visual Studio for your developers to use that as a starting point. None of this going up to Codeplex. None of this listening to Todd Bleakop and his 20-odd steps about how to take a workflow and put it into Visual Studio. It's now there out of the box, and we'll see some of those buttons that we can click upon. So it's a much better story. This is one of the biggest areas of improvements for SharePoint Designer. So here is a little chart so that you can perhaps decide, do I need a workflow, either the browser one, SharePoint Designer or Visual Studio, or do I need a developer to create an event receiver? There's a nice white paper by David Mann who talks a lot about the different workflows in SharePoint Designer 2000, well, in SharePoint 2007 and Windows SharePoint Services that also talks in this area. And a lot of it is still the same for this current version, for the new version. So here is the workflow solution spectrum. So yes, for certain types of work, yes, use the ones in the browser. For other types of work, where you need the declarative solution that you want to deploy it yourself, SharePoint Designer, you see, can only use certain actions that are made available in the installation of SharePoint, and therefore they've been tested, and therefore they're deemed as safe. So therefore deploying a SharePoint Designer workflow doesn't need to go through the big development lifecycle. Whereas Visio Studio, some programmer has written these, and perhaps you're going to have to go through quite a testing mechanism to actually get them onto your box. So there might be a time lag for that. So here's another chart of saying, right, when should I use SharePoint Designer 2010 and when should I use Visual Studio? These slide decks will be available afterwards so that you can perhaps use this as a checkpoint to decide which workflow is best for you. But we're all here to see SharePoint Designer, so let's keep going on. Now, the next thing you've got to do is understand the terminology. Okay. Now, I like to think about a workflow as a pipe that items have to go through to do the particular business process. So here I've got an example of an expenses approval process. So I've got certain people on the left-hand side who want to submit their expenses. Chris at the bottom is at the moment filling in his expense form, perhaps electronically or whatever. Penny's already filled in her form, uploaded it into a document library, and the trigger on that document library says, right, when you upload a document in that document library, please start a workflow instance to look after this particular document. Steve, he's gone through further in the process, in the workflow process, and Peter's expenses have gone all the way through the workflow, and now is complete. So what we have is we have a workflow process, and we have instances of the workflow that may be complete or in progress or not even started yet. Okay. Now the problem is that in the documentation, although it does talk about workflows and workflow instances, it doesn't differentiate between them. It just says workflow. Also, to create that workflow, to create that pipe in the first place, you have to have a workflow template. So it's like a blueprint, right? So that you can then say, you know, it's like a blueprint for a house. So the bungalow or the flat can't be built unless you've got that blueprint. So that pipe can't be built unless we've got a blueprint for it. And those blueprints are called workflow templates. Okay. Now, Visual Studio can create workflow templates. They can't create a workflow from a workflow template. Okay, so the DLL that your Visual Studio people will develop will be the workflow template, and then it's up to you to associate that workflow template with your lists or libraries or sites to create the workflow, to create the pipe. Right? Then once the pipe is created, then you can, or people can manually start a workflow instance, or as I've said, there could be a trigger that starts a workflow instance for that person. And as I say, it's important to realize this. In the previous version, SharePoint Designer could not create a workflow template. In this version, it can. So you can create a workflow in SharePoint Designer. You can then use that as a workflow template on other sites, or you can associate that workflow template with a content type. And then when people use that content type, they'll get created for them a workflow process so that when that list is created on that workflow template, you can start workflow instances in that workflow. So it's important what you're doing. Also, SharePoint Designer 2007 could only create the pipe. Okay? It couldn't create the workflow template, as I said. Now, the pipe on your lists and libraries, the way it's visualized is by a column. So when you associate a workflow template with a list or library, it creates a column with the name that you've given to your workflow process. And one of the common problems when you create a workflow from a workflow template is that you choose the name of a column that already exists. Okay? And that's how you're going to monitor your workflow instances, by looking down the column of that workflow column. Now, just the same in SharePoint Designer 2007, you can't start workflow instances in SharePoint Designer. You can only start them in the browser. You can associate your workflow with a list or library, or you can create it as a template in SharePoint Designer. And you can associate a template with a list or a library or a site in SharePoint Designer, so you can build the pipe as well. So this is the workflow lifecycle. So it's just getting used to the terminology, because in certain products you'll see one terminology, in another product you'll see different terminology, like they won't talk about workflow templates, they'll just talk about workflows. So the first thing you've got to do is associate a workflow template with a list or library. So that creates the workflow. You can then initiate workflows in that workflow. Sometimes if you do a manual initiation of a workflow, you'll have an initiation form, okay? So that somebody has to enter data before the workflow instance starts. And then once it's gone all the way through the pipe, it's completed. And you might need to go back and you need to modify that workflow. And then you can delete it as well. So, SharePoint Designer, this is the tool for information workers and business analysts. It is also targeted at developers now as a rapid application tool, because as I say, one of the things we can do now is export the workflow template in a solutions file, reuse it on other sites or other site collections, and we can also bring it into Visual Studio. So what's new? Well, we've got a ribbon, a workflow tab. So that's no news. We can create our workflow in Visio. So our business analysts who know nothing about SharePoint Designer can work out what the business process is, and then they'll give us the Visio diagram, and we can then create the SharePoint Designer workflow from that Visio file. So the Visio file is called the Visio Workflow interface file, I think it is. Sorry? Sorry? All right, okay. So yes, tell your business analyst to export it in the right format so that SharePoint Designer can import it. What we can also do when we create a workflow in SharePoint Designer, we can say, yes, we want it to be a reusable workflow. Okay? We want to reuse it on other lists, on other sites. Okay? Now, what we need to do to make sure we use it on other lists or other sites is we need to export it as a Windows solution package. Okay? Then we can upload it into perhaps our solutions file in a particular site collection, and then we can activate it as the solution file, and then we can activate it on particular sites within that site collection, and I will show you that. We can also, this is a nice biggie, we can reuse the built-in workflows. So the content approval of the, the approval workflow, the collect signatures workflow, okay? We can use them as a basis. In the previous version, if you wanted something very similar to the approval process, you had to start from a blank sheet of paper and try to recreate it again, okay? Now we can reuse it.
I think it's because if you use the built-in approval, it does some nice things in Word with like an InfoPath stuff. Is that part of the workflow?
Yeah, you can use that, and you can customize it, and you can add additional forms or whatever. If you're using SharePoint Server, then automatically SharePoint Designer will create InfoPath forms for you. Okay. If you're using SharePoint Foundation, then it will be creating ASPX pages. Okay. We've also got something here called impersonation, right? And I'll talk about that. I've got a whole slide on that later on. So let's go in and let's play around with certain things. So let's start off with Visio. So I've got Visio opened already. As you can see, I have recently used the SharePoint Workflow template. But if you haven't used it before, then you need to go into the flowchart template gallery, and you will find the Microsoft SharePoint Workflow template here. You can't use any template. You must use this one if you want to export your business process into SharePoint Designer. So I'm going to use that one. So I'm going to create a diagram. So here's my diagram, and we'll notice on the side we've got a number of charts available to us. So here's some quick shapes. We've got the workflow actions, we've got workflow conditions, and we've also got the terminator and start. So, of course, every single workflow has to have a start and a finish. And then we could say, right, let's add a condition. So I'm going to compare data source. We could pretend that I want to move data from one file to another, one document library to another, and I could specify that it's on a particular criteria that I'm going to move the file from one document library to another. I can then have some actions. So what I usually like to do is perhaps I want to send an email. So once I've moved the file, I'll send an email to somebody. I always like to write away to the log file so that I've got some kind of idea of what's going on. So where's the log file? I can't find the log file. Oh, yes, thank you very much. So I'll write a log file both to when it succeeds and when it doesn't. So I need to join these all up to tell it which order to do these in. And I need to, if I'm the business analyst, right, I'm not going to, that's not my terminology, compare one data source to another. He needs to explain what he wants to compare. So and it'll be in his English, so it'll be his file, a document content type. And then what do I need to log into history? So moved. Who do I need to send the email to? And what need I log after that? Now, what we've also got at the top here, in Visio Studio, we've got a tab called Process. And what we need to do is, before we export this file in, so that we can use it in SharePoint Designer, is we need to check the diagram to make sure we've adhered to it, everything. And up it comes, and it tells us that there's certain problems with the diagram we've already created. And like any good system, if I highlight the error message, it should highlight the thing that's wrong. So you can see here, it's saying that the condition does not have a connector label. Because really, if it's condition, it should be a yes or a no, yes? And I haven't got a yes or no. So if I was trying to build a workflow from this, I wouldn't know which of those two tasks I should do if that condition is correct. So I just right button click and say yes on that one, right button click that one and say no. And of course, I have not completed it. I haven't connected anything to the terminated thing. So, oops. Too small. Now let's give it one more check. Okay. What have I done wrong? Must connect two workflow checks. Ah, right, that thing isn't there properly. Okay. No issues, that's good. I was going to say it's only a simple thing. Now we can export it. So let's call it SP-Evo D2. Now I can start SharePoint Designer, and so I can go to a site. I click in the navigation pane the workflow artifact, and now from here I can import that Visio diagram. Now, if this is on SharePoint Server, then that Visio diagram will again be used to show the progress through the workflow. Now, I've got two choices here. Do I want to associate this workflow with a list or a library? So here are all the lists or libraries in this particular site. So this would be exactly the same way as you currently do in SharePoint 2007. Or do I want to make it a reusable workflow? So I'm going to come back and do another demo for reusable workflow, so we'll just create it on the shared documents document library and finish. Now all you've done in Visio is really just comment what you want the workflow to do. As you can see, I've still got the blue underscore values. So now I have to fill them in. So I can say, right, now this box you should all be familiar with. So I can say if content type is equal to document, right, email these users. Now this is quite nice. This bit's the same. So you've got the same options as you've got in SharePoint 2007. But here, do you remember, you could only put a lookup value, and so the trick was to create a string, build up your string, and then point to the string in here for your subject. Now, we've got what we should have had. Okay, so you can build up this string here. And it works the same as all the other boxes like this. So we'll put the name of the file. So, yes, yeah. No, I don't think they have. Some things we'll have to try in RTM. Right, and here the same as before. So I could get the person who created the file. Okay. And then I can log the message. And again, we've got the nice box. We don't have to build up the string and then bung it in. So we can say name. Now these bits in grey are comments. Right? If you then come in and you start mucking around and you start moving actions back down and up or whatever, there's no way in SharePoint Designer to amend those grey bits. Okay? So you really need to export it into Visio and bring it back in again if you want to make sure that the diagram is working correctly. Okay? It doesn't act by magic underneath the covers. Okay? Or else you would be all out of work, wouldn't you? Sorry? Yes, the other bits, yeah. Right, so I can check for errors. No errors contained. Now, usually when you start a workflow in SharePoint Designer, you usually end up with that first page of the wizard that says give the workflow a name. Okay? Whereas when I exported it straight in, it's almost like I'm on the second page here. So before I publish it, I want to go back and add and give it a proper name. And also say, when should a workflow instance be initiated for this workflow? So I'm going to use the breadcrumb to go back to that page, that general page, that allows me to give it a proper name. And to decide what's going to trigger workflow instances in this workflow. Then I'm going to publish it. So you can see there it's creating an InfoPath form as the initiation page. Okay? Because that's where the XSN is. It's not creating an ASPX page. If I did it on SharePoint Foundation, it would be an ASPX page. Sorry? Yes, yeah, you can do that on standard. I've done that as well and it works fine. You just won't get the visual picture, the visualization of the process, because SharePoint Foundation does not include Visio Services. Okay? You can use a Visio diagram to create the workflow in SharePoint Designer, but when you publish it, it's not publishing the Visio diagram to be displayed by Visio Services, because there is no Visio Services in SharePoint Foundation. That's a SharePoint server service. Yeah?
So Foundation is
Windows SharePoint Services 3.0.
then we still have with what was more standard and enterprise.
That's right.
What you're saying is with standard, you will be able to do the Visio.
Yes. You will see it pictorially in the browser. I think so. I don't know if they've released exactly what's thing yet. I believe it's part of standard. Oh, yes, it must be. It must be. Right. So underneath the covers, those 3 sets of files, those 4 sets of files that you created in SharePoint Designer 2010 is there. If you want to have a look at them, you can do all files. And you've got the workflow, where is it? I can't find it now. It's somewhere there. I just can't see it. That's the task. The workflow task. A nice thing, I don't know if you noticed, when I opened this, you can actually pick the task list if you want to assign tasks to people and you want to write away to the history log. You can actually specify the history log and you can specify the task list. Remember in SharePoint Designer 2007, you couldn't, but you could do that little trick. Rename the task list to alphabetically the first task list in your site, and it would pick that as the task list to create all your task items to. Okay? But now you can specifically choose a task item. So if we go to that site, so I can't see views like, oh, there it is. Dear. Okay, so I'm going to go to internet. So, right, sorry, wrong one. So if I go to the shared documents document library on this site, and I pick a particular document. Now, you could do it the same as before, you know, click the drop down and say workflows, but of course you've got the ribbon. And so there is the workflow that I've created in SharePoint Designer. And off we go. So just the same as before. Other things you can do in SharePoint Designer, so if I bring this one back up again, so if I edit the workflow, what you can also do is you can do an associate columns. So if you've linked, when you've linked your document, when you've linked your workflow to a list or library, perhaps you want to test a value in the column. But that document library does not have that column. So what you can do is you can say, this workflow needs these associated columns to actually work. And if those columns are not created on that document library or list, then the workflow will create those columns for you. So that's good, isn't it? So I might want, for example, to have a status column on my list. This is particularly useful if you're creating a reusable one. You don't know what columns are going to be on the document libraries or list that you're going to associate this workflow with. So I'm going to use a site column. So I'm going to use the status one, which is a choice one, which will have, is it pending, is it approved, or whatever. So if we go back to this document library again, right, so that one, so that's completed because all it did was send an email and whatever. But if we go back, so at the moment, if you have a look at those columns, I do not have a status column. So I'm going to say, right, so perhaps I want to add, in my workflow, I want to add another action that says, right, as I'm in this portion of the workflow, I want to set the status in that status column as draft or something like that. So I'm going to add a new action. So I'm looking for something that's going to set a field value. Now, I could click the actions, and from all the actions, I could click the action that I want. But what is provided here is some like IntelliSense. So I could just type the words of the action that I want to look for, and you can see there that it's found 9 possible actions that might meet my needs. So I want to set a field in the current item. So which field do I want to set? I want to set the status. So even though that status column isn't created yet, because I associated it, it knows that that is a possible column, and it does appear in the drop-down. So now I can say I want to set it to a particular value. It's picked up all the choices from that site column. And again, I can publish it. The Visio diagram, no, it won't work. Oh, I've never tried it. Yeah. I don't know whether it showed the old picture or whether it won't show it at all. Yeah, I can export it again. Yes, it will contain that as an action, yeah. I'd have to try that out and see. Right, so I've published it. Right. So I need to go back to the document library. I'm going to start it again. Sorry, I'm doing it the old-fashioned way instead of using the ribbon. Yes. Yeah. No. In InfoPath Designer. Designer's made up of, InfoPath's now made up of 2 products. One that you view forms to fill them in, and one that you design your forms with. So that's completed. Let's just check to see if that new column's been created. And down here we've got the status column. Okay. Sorry? It's bundled up as part of that workflow, just like before the ASPX initiation page in SharePoint Designer is bundled up as part of the workflow.
With the SharePoint Designer 2010, I know in 2007, for example, we want to automate the process of calling the expense, for example, here on a weekly basis. So it goes to the director on a weekly basis, so done every day, it goes on a weekly basis. We have used Business Studio in SharePoint 2007. In 2010, can we automate using the
You can do a pause, just like you could in SharePoint 2007. You could say, right, pause for a week, and then it would kick off again. Yeah, you can do a pause. So the workflow doesn't finish until it kicks back in again. If you want to do it regularly like that, I suppose like in a continuous circle, then you can do it using like secondary lists. There is no for or while loop, even in this version. No. So you'd have to use the same trick as before. Right. The server has got certain values that it has to stop workflows from overtaking the servers. And you can actually say where those workflow timer jobs are actually run. So that's on your central administration, and there's some defaults. This white paper that I told you about to David Mann, he's done a lot of research in that area. His proviso is don't touch the defaults. I don't know what he will say about SharePoint 2010, but that's why sometimes if you do a pause and you say pause for a second, it won't actually kick in for 5 minutes. Well, that's because the SP timer job only runs, I think, every 2 minutes. But if you've got loads of workflow instances, then, of course, your workflow is going to be at the back. It will only batch up so many workflows at a time so that the premise with SharePoint is that any one thing shouldn't have a detrimental effect on everything else that SharePoint has to do. So, yes, a good question. So that's something quite nice. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. It's all these starting with a V. I say visual instead of Visio and whatever. It must know it's the end of day. All right. So here are all the new actions. Okay. There's some nice ones there that you might like to do. So lookup manager of a user. So that you had to, in fact, install from Codeplex if you wanted that. You can change the permissions of a list item or whatever. So some of them have disappeared, and so these ones here, so we were talking about creating the dynamic string that you could use elsewhere. So now they've got rid of the build dynamic string, which was one action, and now you've got a bit more subtlety, or whatever you like to call it, more options, but they've created 4 options in its place. So loads of ones to play around there with. Sorry? I can't remember. Well, you can start an approval process, and you can start the feedback process. Can't see it. I can't see it there. We'd have to check. There's some more conditions. Some of them are replacements, but we can also do things like, is this person a valid SharePoint user? So that people don't put in a name that isn't of a particular user, so you can't. So you can check it before you perhaps send or assign a value to them. Now, one of the things I talked about was impersonation. So this is in addition to those actions we've seen. It's a new step. And what you say is, I want to start a new step, and all the actions and conditions in this step are going to be run not by the person who starts the process instance, because that's what the default is. It's whoever starts that workflow instance that workflow is run under. And so that has caused problems in SharePoint Designer 2007, where you wanted to move a document from one document library to another. The person had the permissions to upload the document in the current document library, but they didn't have the permissions in the document library that you wanted to move the document to. Okay, so you all followed that. So what you can do is say, right, these actions within this step impersonate another user. And what it is, you're impersonating it as the person who authored the workflow. Okay. So that's the how the workflows instance is going to run. And so inside of it, you've got a number of set of actions that can use that impersonated value to do those actions. Now, the problem with that is if the person leaves and your HR department deletes their user ID, then, of course, you're going to have to know about that and take over the impersonation. You're going to have to associate your user ID with that workflow. So another thing for documenting your workflows as you go along. So let's play around with the reusable ones. So I'm only going to create a simple one. I just want to show you how to export a reusable one and use it on another set of sites. Right? It's easy to associate it with another document library or list within the same site, but I want to show you how to reuse it on a different site. So let's close down these workflows. So I'm going to create a reusable one. You'll see here that you've got these globally reusable ones. These are the out-of-the-box ones, the approval ones, okay, that you can start out of the box. You can use them as a basis. But I'm going to create my own brand new reusable one. So I'm going to call it SP Reuse. And you can specify which content type you want to reuse this workflow on, or you could say any content type. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make it really simple. I'm going to have it as right into the log file. Let's give it a nice name. And again, we've got different options here for the initiation. We could say if somebody's going to reuse this, then they mustn't be able to manually start it. So we can do some rules there as well. So let's check. Yeah, it contains no errors. Publish, save. So I often said when I was doing SharePoint Design, it's nice to have your own little site where you do all the things that you want to do. So it's not like a public a production site that other people can get hold of. And then, you know, if you're creating like a data view web part or whatever, then you can export it from your site. It's the same with this. If you're creating all your reusable ones, perhaps your whole organisation should have a site where they create all the reusable ones. So if somebody's ill or something and you need to make amendments, you know where to go to find that reusable one. So I'm now going to save it as a template. You can see other things there. So this you can export it out so that someone in Visual Studio can then have that as a basis. You can also publish it globally within this site collection, but I want to reuse it somewhere else. So I'm going to save it as a template. And what it does, it packages up, for example, the InfoPath form, the XML files, and so on, and it puts it into the Site Assets Library, which is a new library on every site that's created in SharePoint 2010, whether it's SharePoint Foundation or SharePoint Server. So now I need to go to that library. So the easiest way is to use SharePoint Designer to open up that library. Where is it? I thought I did. Let's save it as a template again. It says Site Assets Library. Now, 1 minute ago. I don't know why it didn't open the right one. So here it is. So I'm going to now save it. So this could be in your pre-production environment, this could be in your development environment, and now you've tested out your workflow, and now you do want to put it in your production environment. Or if you're using SharePoint Online, you could then upload it into your SharePoint Online websites. So how do you use it? Well, you need to go up to the Solutions library at the top of your site collection. So I need to go to Site Settings. So at the top of your site collection, underneath Galleries, you'll see a Solutions library. So I need to upload that solution file. No, you can use it. Yes, that's right. Now, of course, if you've created it on a SharePoint server, right, and therefore it's created InfoPath forms, that will only work on another SharePoint server where there is the InfoPath service running. Okay, you can't move it from to SharePoint Foundation, but you could move a SharePoint Foundation to SharePoint Server. Similarly, there's another reason why you can't move it the other way around. There are certain actions now that are SharePoint Server specific. SharePoint Designer doesn't come with all the actions and conditions. It's when it connects up to the site that it gets downloaded all the actions that you're allowed to do on that site. Okay. So let's browse to the Solutions file. So all we're doing here is we've loaded the solution. We need to activate it so that the solution is available. It's still not going to appear in the choice of workflow templates yet. We've got to do something else. Right. So I've now activated it. So the only thing I can do now with that solution is deactivate it. So I now go to the site. Where I want to use that workflow. I go to the Site Settings page, and then underneath the Site Features, I need to activate that workflow template. And that workflow template should now be available for me because I said I can use it with any content type. I can use that workflow template to create a workflow on any of the lists and libraries on this particular site. So, Oh, sorry, I got to add a workflow. So down here, there is the SP reuse template. I give it a unique name. Remember, this unique name is going to become a column. And I can choose which task lists and whatever. And now I can start workflow instances for that particular workflow. So on your 12 hive, as I said, all the actions, if you did create your own actions, are actually kept in this particular folder. We call it the root directory now, not the 14 hive, sorry. So this is a SharePoint server root directory, and you can see now there are 2 action files. One WSS.action, and the other one called the MOS.action. In the previous version, you only had actions that were really WSS actions. You didn't have any actions specific to the server. Now you have got ones that you will see if you've got a server site, but you won't see if you've just got SharePoint Foundation. So even though you're using the same SharePoint Designer, you could see different actions available to you. Also, we've just now created a new workflow template, okay? So that wouldn't be seen on another site. So that finishes near enough the whole presentation. And I'm only a couple of minutes over, so that's not bad for me. So let's just summarise. Always check your workflows. You've got 2 places to check your workflows now. In Visio, right, before you export it. And then also in SharePoint Designer before you start publishing it. Always make sure you test your workflows. Just don't let your users start playing around with them and hope everything's okay. Make sure you document them, so that, especially if you're using that impersonation, so that somebody else can take over from you. I always suggest perhaps using a task list per workflow, and now that's a lot easier in SharePoint Designer, because as you mentioned, you could have thousands of workflow instances in a workflow, and so these lists could get quite large. Always remember to click publish, because I've done that sometimes. I've amended the workflow and I wonder what on earth happened to it. It's the same as the previous version. Every time you publish it, a new workflow is actually created for you. The old one is set as no workflow instances can start. So I always say try and tidy up after yourself. Okay. So some things, a lot of the things are not much different than before. So that's what I'm talking about there. So look after them. Try to keep your workflows simple. I know they can get quite complex, but you don't want to create a Heath Robinson solution, okay? And then nobody dares touch it because they're afraid it'll break it. So try and do that. Troubleshooting is still a challenge, so please do write away to your history log, or create another list that you keep writing away to as some ways of debugging what's actually happening and what's going on wrong. Common problems, as I've said, is there's a defect in your logic. No, never, okay? You use the name when you create a workflow based off of a workflow template, or when you create a workflow in SharePoint Designer, you use the name of an existing column. Okay, there are problems. If you have an initiation page, so that if people manually start a workflow, that's the page they're going to use to enter values. Some problems I've seen there is if that workflow automatically gets started, then you need to make sure you set default values for these initiation variables, or again, it's going to not like it. Sometimes you can have network issues. Sometimes, like when you're moving a list item to another list, you've forgotten that that person who's moving it will not have access to that other list. But we've got the impersonation thing to get round that, because people forever add new people to the list of who can have access. The same thing before. Don't create your workflows using systems account, okay? Because they won't work, all right? Make sure you sign on as somebody who isn't systems account. Systems account is the account that you use to install SharePoint. So usually, in a big production, you wouldn't be able to use that. But if this is your development machine, you probably always sign on as the same user. So, go and try it. We don't have to do the trial for very much longer. In a couple of days, perhaps next week, we'll have the RTM version available to you. So, go and have a look. Get to know Visio 2010. There are some free videos available, and I've put the links there, and there's some workflows as well of how to take a reusable SharePoint Designer workflow and import it into Visual Studio. So that's it. Thank you again for coming. Any questions, if you'd like to come up afterwards, or tweet away to the SPEVO IW tweet ID. Thank you very much.